YouTube and welcome back to my channel. This channel is for beginner photographers to get some tips and tricks to improve your photography and your photography business. This video today is going to be about Aperture, which is our part 2 of our 3-part series on the exposure triangle. Firstly, we need to discuss what actually is aperture. The aperture in your camera is kind of like the pupil of our eye. In a lens, it's the size of the hole that allows the light to come into the camera and onto the shutter. You can see the different sizes of aperture with some lenses as they open and close. This here is a wide aperture. So this is a really wide hole in our lens. If we spin it, we've got here, you can see a really small hole. This is a really small aperture. Okay, so now we know what aperture is, we need to figure out how to change it on our camera. Every camera is different, so if this little video I've got coming up next doesn't help you, have a look in your manual or go into Google and figure out how to change it on your camera. It'll probably be something similar to this, just a bit of a dial. Okay, now we've figured out how to change our aperture, we're going to talk about why we would change our aperture and the creative reason behind changing our aperture. Aperture is represented on our camera with an F number, or also known as an f-stop. It can get a little bit confusing because, as we've discussed, we've got a small hole and a big hole. However, the big hole is represented with a small f number and a little hole is represented with a large f number. An easier way of remembering this is with your depth of field. So the depth of field in an image is how much is in focus, and we control this with our aperture. And this is how we can get a bit creative with our use of aperture. So with a small number, you're going to have a small amount of focus in your image. With a big F number, you're going to have a lot of your image in focus. So we've got different uses for both of these. So a lot of wildlife photography is using quite a small F number, so a small depth of field, and that's so they can make the animal stand out against the background. And so you've got like a blurry green background. With a big F number, you'll have a big amount of your image in focus. This is more used in landscape photography, so when you've got a really pretty landscape and you've got all the mountains and all the foreground in focus, that'll be using a big F number. So that's the creative way of using this. A lot of people have been asking in photography groups at the moment how to get a background blurry. And now we know how we do that. We do that with setting a small F number. So even though this is a big aperture, it will be a small number to have a small amount of focus. How much you can put in focus will depend on your lenses. So all lenses are different, and unlike the shutter speed, like we discussed in our last video, it's completely controlled by the camera. Your aperture is more controlled by the lens, as the lens determines how high or low an f-stop can be. This lens here is nicknamed the Nifty 50. It's a 50mm lens, so its zoom is stuck at 50mm, and this can go all the way down to a 1.8 aperture. This is really, really wide. I mean, you can get wider lenses at like f1.4 or f1.2, but I just have an f1.8. With this lens, we can get down to an f-stop of f2.8. You can tell on the lens how small of an aperture you can achieve by a little number on the lens. So this lens here can achieve a low aperture of f2.8. You can tell this by the little number just about there. Of all or most lenses have this feature, you just need to find it. I've got here a little example of the same image taken with different apertures, so you can see the difference the aperture has on the background and the foreground of the image. So I'm focusing on the orange here, so everything else will either be focused because there's a large f number, or it'll be out of focus because there's a small f number. Okay, so now we've discussed the creative ways of using and changing aperture, but there's also another reason we might be changing our aperture, and that's because of the control of light. So just like shutter speed, it has a creative way of using it and a more technical lighting way of using it. So just like the pupil of the eye, the aperture controls how much light can come in to the camera. If you've noticed, on a really bright day, your pupils are really small, and this is to try and stop too much light coming in, because our eyes, they're kind of like cameras on auto. It will control how much light we see so nothing looks too bright. If it's a really dark day, you might notice that your pupils are quite large. That's the same with aperture. If we want to let only a little bit of light into the camera, we're going to have a really small hole. And if we want to let a lot of light into the camera, we're going to have a really wide hole. So just like our pupil. I've also set up a few different examples here of the same image with different f-stops, so you can see how much the aperture affects the lighting in the camera. So the only thing changed in these was the aperture. Okay, so thank you for watching this video. That's everything there is to know about aperture, and I hope we're kind of getting a much better idea of how we can control everything in our camera and use it in manual mode so we can get the best images. The next episode in this series is going to be about ISO. This is sometimes a bit of a tricky one, and it's one that I've seen a lot of people struggle with. That's all for today, so if you like this channel, then subscribe. If there's anything you want me to discuss, let me know in the comments below. And if that's everything, then give this a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.